everyone. Welcome to the Water Online Show. I am your host, Travis Kennedy. I'm here with my esteemed colleague, Mr. Kevin Westerling. You are in the flow, and we have a very special guest. A lot happened in last week, a lot to catch up on, and we have just the right person to help us get caught up on all the big happenings that happened last week. I don't know, Kev. There was a lot to try and digest, make out, figure out what is actually happening. The big event that the industry was waiting for, that they kept us waiting on for, a year, maybe even more than that, finally happened. Kevin, what happened last week? What am I referring to? What is the exciting news?
Well, EPA finalized the PFAS regulations that everybody has been talking about. It's been hitting mainstream news.
Will it happen? Will it not happen?
We think
finally happened.
We kind of knew it was going to happen.
Yeah.
But they finally came down, so now it's official. And we have just the person to talk about it and sort it out. Now that it's here, utilities have to deal with it. So that's what we're here to talk about.
It's time to deal with it.
Yeah.
The answer is here. Now it's time for action. We're going to get right down to business, and we are going to have a nice discussion here about how you can go about this. What is the approach? What are the things you should be thinking about? What it is you should be looking out for? How to move forward? All of it. We're going to cover it all. And here to help us cover it all is none other than Kyle Thompson, who is the National PFAS Lead for Carollo Engineers. Kyle, thank you very much. I cannot thank you or let you know just how appreciative us here at Water Online on the Water Online Show and our audience to have you here to help answer some of these questions. Welcome to the Water Online Show in the Flow.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
Of course. Yeah, I second that. Thanks so much. You being the expert, let's just throw them at you. As I referenced, the new MCLs came down early last week. There was the proposal out, but did anything change between the proposal that everybody had read before and we're anticipating versus the final rule and what that looks like?
Right. So the final rule, I would say, is mostly the same as the proposed rule. There are a lot of little tweaks here and there. I'd say the biggest and most surprising change was that they extended the compliance window from 3 years to 5 years.
That's a big difference.
So that's something a lot of people are asking for. I honestly didn't really see that coming, that they made that change, but a lot of people are asking for that, and that's good news. Because especially for a large utility, to construct a whole new, asset, a whole new step in the water treatment process, can easily take more than 3 years. And even just to do a PFAS study, to decide, what media you're going to use, whether you go ion exchange or activated carbon, to do a pilot for these technologies, especially if you're just a little bit over the limit to start with, can take years in itself before even then use those results to start doing the design and construction, right? So that's really great news that that'll make it it'll still be can be very expensive to comply. It's a much more realistic timeline, and it will then enable less of a rush, right? Less of a rush pace going about that process of doing the study, doing the pilot if you so choose, as opposed to bench scale testing and then going about the installation or construction. So that I would say is the biggest and most surprising change compared to what was proposed 13 months ago, and that's a good thing.
I mean, another thing that elongated time frame is going to give municipalities a chance to do is actually communicate, right? So communicate with their constituents, because this is, it may be big news for all of us here in the marketplace. For, the average person who is living in a town or a municipality that has this issue or even doesn't, it's important for them to have the proper communication channels lined up and execute on those and keep those constituents informed as they go along the way. So that elongated time frame, very beneficial, without a doubt. So let's get down to specifics. So what are the numbers? What do the numbers say? What are the limits that the EPA decided to settle on? And then obviously just as important is, how realistic is it to achieve those numbers?
Right. So the final numbers, they're 4 nanogram per liter for PFOA, 4 nanogram per liter for PFOS, because those are what they call the long chains. Those are the ones that have been on the radar for the longest time, most studies about them. So those are actually the EPA concluded those are so toxic that they set the limit for those as low as can be reliably measured. So they'll call that a method reporting limit or a practical quantitation limit. So it's very, very low for those two PFAS. And then for three other PFAS, so PFHXS, PFNA, and then one called, some people call it Gen X, other people call it HFPO/DA. I call it Gen X.
We'll call it Gen X,
Yeah,
right?
Gen X is a little easier.
Greatest generation in the world, so it's associated with the toxin.
Not to be confused with people who grew up in the 80s.
Right.
Yeah, so I prefer to say Gen X. So those three each got a limit at 10 nanogram per liter, also known as a part per trillion. So a little higher than the other two, but still very, very low limits. And then where it gets a little hard to explain, they also did this thing called a hazard index, where each of those, where basically a mixture of PFAS has to be below a total level weighted by the toxicity of each of the four PFAS. So those three I mentioned, they each get divided by the same level, that same 10 nanogram per liter level as their individual MCL. But then this other thing, another one called PFBS. So it's a little bit less toxic because it's what they call a short chain PFAS. It's less bioaccumulative, so it's less toxic. So it gets divided by a larger number. It gets divided by 2,000 nanogram per liter. So you've got the three that each get divided by 10. The PFBS gets divided by 2,000, and then you add that all up, and then that's supposed to be below 1. So a little hard to explain, but you see it written down in the equation. That's a little.
I follow Kyle, no problem. Like I mean,
got that.
Simple arithmetic, if you ask me.
No, but that is a lot to wrap your head around, and so I think utilities are going to need that full 5 years that you had mentioned. So that's nice that they have those extra 2 years. So we're looking at a timeline to comply, late 2029. And so even though they have the 5 years, you don't want to wait, you want to get started right away. So what would be the steps to get going on? Okay, I guess first would be monitor, find out if you have it. But can you walk us through what the compliance process might look like?
Sure, but first I want to go back to something. Travis mentioned this, and you kind of mentioned this, Kevin. So communication, right?
Mm-hmm.
The communication is always key, right? But it's especially important given this timeline that's been laid out, because they're saying the compliance window is 5 years, but after 3 years, you have to start mentioning the PFAS number. So you still have to measure the PFAS within 3 years, which all the large utilities would have done anyway for this monitoring program called UCMR5. But so everybody still has to measure PFAS within 3 years. And then after 3 years, they have to start putting it in your public annual water quality report. So you don't have to say in that report, this is an exceedance of a rule. You don't have to start saying that until the 5 year mark. But at the 3 year mark, you have to start putting these PFAS numbers in your annual report, and then anybody can see that and then Google what these MCLs are going to be in another year or two, and then that could raise a lot of concern, right? So I think communication's always key, but especially if you do get to that 3 year mark, haven't gotten the treatment installed yet, it's going to be especially important at that point in time. Because there's still a lot of people. So there's a lot of people who are already very, very passionate about this. So, but there's a lot of people who still haven't heard of it. So a survey came out. 45% of people said they hadn't heard of these letters PFAS at all. And the majority of people, 75%, so even the few that said they'd seen that acronym, 75% of people couldn't tell you what it is. Jeez. And that survey is just a year or two. And then even with this MCL announcement, to me, this is a huge deal. To me, this as a water professional, this is a huge deal. This is the first new MCL on a new chemical in 24 years, right? So
Holy,
just
really? What was it? What was the one 24 years ago? Arsenic?
so there was the radionuclides rule. So uranium and I think a couple others, they got MCLs in the year 2000,
Okay.
right?
Good try
So
though, Travis.
I tried.
yeah.
I could have sworn arsenic was in there somewhere.
Yeah, so
That's bad too.
there's been rule changes since there's like revisions to the DBP rule, revisions to the copper and lead rule, but there hasn't been a whole new rule on a whole new chemical since 2000. So, put that in perspective. You back in the year 2000, like, oh, like there's this new thing called pop punk, and there's this new thing called the internet. Like, I don't know if you've heard of
Right.
the internet yet, but there's this website called Amazon where you can buy a book. Like that's where we were last time there was a new MCL
Having
for
just
new chemical.
graduated
So
college.
yeah,
You know that going for me?
yeah,
What's up?
He's older than that.
there are people who have graduated college and been working in the real world for 2 years who weren't born yet. The last time there was a new MCL on a new chemical. So whether you agree with this or not, whether you like this or not, this is a big deal. This is a moment in history, as far as the water professionals, the water industry.
Also,
Um,
yeah.
and so going back to that point, right? So it's going to be um a big mission, to not only tackle this problem, but also to explain to the public who are first hearing about these chemicals, first hearing about some of the alarming health effects that have been linked, to explain to them that we hear their concerns and that we're doing the best we can, and we are gonna to take care of this issue. So that is very, very important. But yeah, so as far as the steps go, so first step, measure it, right? So you gotta know what you're dealing with. And then I would say an important step in the process is look into sources, right? So there could be, so the main two, PFOA, PFOS, these were no longer intentionally manufactured in the United States as of 2015. But there's been cases where there were companies that were still using stockpiles that were identified, companies that were sort of intentionally creating them as a byproduct. And then because, for decades, people have been putting their, scratched Teflon pans in the garbage, their fluorinated carpet, fluorinated t-shirts, putting all these things in the garbage. So landfill leachate can be a source. So there's a couple different, or even just plumes of PFAS that's been spilled into the groundwater. These plumes can be, spreading. So and then also a lot of times, particularly for large utilities, a lot of different water sources, maybe, you've got a hit at one well, but your other wells are fine. And, you definitely want to be careful if maybe the plume is headed in the direction of the wells without it. But, there's cases where just, changing the supply, or, there may be cases, and some cases you can't. Sometimes even if you find the source, it's kind of, it's spilled milk. The plume's already there and to diffuse to tackle, but it's certainly worth looking into whether you can do a source-based solution, right? And so then if you do need to do treatment, if it's concluded you do need to do treatment, you could jump straight into it, right? So there's been a lot of studies on the most effective technologies. We already know which types of activated carbon, for example, tend to be best for PFAS, but there can be site-specific differences and how well things work depending on the water quality, and also site-specific differences and the prices of materials depending on how far they're trucking it from the warehouse. So it is good to do a study, right? So there's this thing called speaking of things that are a little confusing. It's a long acronym, RSSCT. So it's called a rapid small scale column test, and this is an established procedure that lets you test materials like activated carbon, and they've adapted it for ion exchange as well. And so you can test these materials for PFAS in a matter of weeks instead of in a matter of months or even years. And so you always get the most confident results doing things at the full scale or as close to the full scale as you can. But comparing the time and the cost and the quality of data, it's a great idea to do RSSCTs, figure out which media, which sorbent is going to work best for you, and get an estimate of how often you're going to have to replace it to try to figure out what your long-term costs are going to be. And then there's different, and then you can, so then once you have that, once you have the results from those tests, you can do some computer modeling. So at Corolla, we have this decision support water modeling platform called Blue Planet. So at times we'll do this RSSCT modeling. We have different equations and methods where we can do these predictions in the models and test different configurations of this facility within that computer software. And there's other ways to do it, but that's how we do it. And then so once you've chosen your media, chosen your configuration, then you move on to the detailed design. And then what's often done, so if you're doing GAC or ion exchange, it'll come in these big pressurized vessels, so these big like metal cylinders, and so oftentimes these are prefabricated, and so that makes it a little quicker to install if you do move forward with that treatment style. But if you're talking a very large utility, then you'd need 50 plus of these things, and then with the valves and stuff, that gets very complicated. So a larger utility, they might choose to do like a concrete facility within which to do the activated carbon. But what's been most commonly done so far is to have these pressurized vessels that can be prefabricated, brought to site, and installed on a site.
So I was actually going to ask the question about what treatment technologies are available, what factors might lead a utility to sort of choose one over another, but you've just covered a lot of that. So yeah, sort of as a summary, if you wouldn't mind just touching on those two questions that are related, which is what technologies are available, and without talking about specific vendors, what technologies currently exist to help a utility or municipality get there, and then what conditions do municipalities need to think about when utilizing one over another?
Right. So the three main ones are activated carbon, ion exchange, and reverse osmosis. That's what people usually say when they're asked the effective full-scale ready treatment technologies for PFAS. Other ones, so nanofiltration is another one. So if you have a tight, what they call a tight nanofiltration, that's sort of like almost a reverse osmosis, that can remove PFAS as well. It's been less done so far, but I think that's something that we are going to see. And then powdered activated carbon. So you put granular activated carbon in a filter, like in a vessel or a gravity contact basin. But then you can also have this powdered activated carbon where it's a similar material, but you add it as a powder, for example, in your Floxid basin. And so it doesn't usually, at the typical levels that you would add it, it doesn't get as much percent removal, but it could be a solution if say you're just a little bit over the level. So that's something that hasn't been done as much, but I think we could see more moving forward. So it's really those five, I would say, are kind of the mainstream, but we may see some other things. So for example, at Kroll, we're working on this process called suspended ion exchange. So typically ion exchange, it's works like granular activated carbon, where it's in a filter. So in suspended ion exchange, it's a moving bed. And so there's some benefits to that in terms of the regenerative ability. And then there's also some novel sorbents. So activated carbon, ion exchange, these have been around for longer, but without naming names or vendors, there's definitely some novel sorbents out there that look really promising. So we could see even more of those emerge in the future.
For those of you who listen to the show a lot, I bring a lot of topics and issues back to money. So I've said it probably a million times over the course of my career in this industry that I have never come across an overfunded utility. So my question for you, Kyle, is who's paying for all this? Where's all this money coming from? This is not free, right? So
Right.
manufacturers and solutions providers aren't giving their solutions for nothing. Where's this money coming from?
Well, it's coming from a couple different sources. So there are the lawsuits, right? So there is the 3M lawsuit and the DuPont lawsuit. So the 3M lawsuit, the total settlement is around rounding here, but around $10 billion. The DuPont lawsuit is around $1 billion total. So utilities that have PFAS, if they have opted in, so the deadline to opt in or out of those lawsuits is passed, but the default was opt in the way those lawsuits work. So it is possible to file a claim and receive some level of funding from those settlements. And then there's also money within the Infrastructure Act that was set aside for PFAS and contaminants of emerging concern. So it is possible to get federal funding also in the neighborhood of $10 billion total within that Infrastructure Act, getting aside for things like PFAS. But even those two put together might not cover it. So that's around 10 billion from the 3M lawsuit, around 10 billion from the Infrastructure Act. But the AWWA is estimating that the total capital cost for this could be closer to $40 billion. So it is unfortunately the case that even with the lawsuit assistance and the federal assistance, it is unfortunately the case that some of this expense is likely to fall on ratepayers.
So that's a lot of money that we're talking about. But I will say that in addition to what you just described, we did a feature about a year ago on Horsham, Pennsylvania, which is where we're coming to you from right now, from the Water Online Studios. They were one of the first municipalities hardest hit by PFAS because of firefighting foam being used at an Air Force base about a mile from the town. So they were an early adopter. There wasn't a lot of information out there when they had to treat it. And test for it and all of the things that everybody's going to need to do in the upcoming 3 to 5 years. So what we did find out, though, too, and they put it under the label of the Horsham Way, is there's also money available from the state. So the state actually, our representatives from this area went to Harrisburg, the state capital of Pennsylvania, and came back. And from what I understand, the Horsham residents have not paid a dime for the treatment of it, which is amazing. So there are ways to subsidize the cost of this, but you just have to know where to look. So,
Yeah.
Kyle, that is great direction as to where you can go to find that money. And I'm sure that as more and more of these opportunities pop up, there's going to be different places and additional places where they can go for funding. So, that is luckily also in motion as these regulations come down.
Yeah, the good old Horsham Way. I like that. Another phrase that's applicable to what I'm about to ask is polluter pays. So could you go in a little deeper about the industrial culpability and responsibility and all this? You mentioned big ones that maybe created the chemicals in the first place, and they've gotten hit with the fines. But you also mentioned earlier in this conversation how some people may have bought from them and stockpiled it and still have it, or have somehow manufactured a byproduct of it, or have emitted it already. So what is the state of these industrial entities that have either done it or are still doing it, and what kind of responsibility do they have in cleaning it up or helping municipalities meet these compliance rules?
Right. So it's these lawsuits that I mentioned, the lawsuits against 3M or the settlements, I should say, these settlements with 3M and DuPont. So part of the reason why it's 3M making the settlement instead of say the Air Force or airports or certain users of these chemicals. So I'm the the legal logic behind that, the legal reasoning behind that is that the culpability traces back to the original manufacturer because the manufacturers of these chemicals and certain of the users to the extent that primarily there was the original manufacturers who did testing. They did do animal testing on these chemicals and also tests on their own and employees, right? And so they had results, and so I don't want to make aspersions about any businesses or any individuals, but the way the argument goes is that they had a certain amount of information on the toxicity of these chemicals, but then they didn't communicate that to say the companies that were then using these for electroplating, using these to mix them in with some other chemicals to then make the firefighting foam to sell. Certainly not the folks who are then using this to fight fires, right? So that's sort of the the legal reasoning in terms of where this traces back to whom should have known better. And I will say yeah, it's definitely the ideal outcome that polluter pays, right? That these just DuPont, for example, you'll hear the Robert Bilott, who's the famous lawyer who you kind of pioneered these early cases and the ongoing cases against DuPont. He likes to say they were making $1 billion. They're making $1 billion per year on Teflon alone, right? So it's these companies that profited from the manufacture of these chemicals, whereas the general public and utilities, they're just receiving the water as it comes.
Yep.
Right. And that's, I think, and that's particularly, I think that's, easy to grasp for the water utilities, where it gets a little complicated and it's still true, but a little harder to explain on the wastewater side, right? Because what we see in wastewater, so within the PFAS, so all these kind of PFAS that are in this regulation so far, right? So those are what are called the perfluoral alkyl substances, right? But then you also have these things called the polyfluoral alkyl substances that are part fluorinated, part not. And so, it's really interesting that you can actually have, the perfluoral, those are, you'll hear, activist groups call it forever chemicals, right? Because it's the strongest bond and never breaks down. But you can have these polyfluoroalkyls, the non-fluorinated part can biodegrade. And so in the environment, but then especially in a biologically intensive scenario, like within a wastewater treatment facility, the bugs in those facilities can eat the non-fluorinated part, and then it makes the perfluoroalkyls, it makes it look like they're increasing, that we can measure those in the effluent at higher concentrations than what's coming in. But that's not the wastewater treatment plant's fault. That's in no way their fault.
Sure.
They're just following the regulations. They're treating the water as it comes in, and it's not as far as we know or can tell, it's not coming from any of the chemicals or equipment that they're using. The primary reason for that is just these transformation of these polyfluorinated within the PFAS family, but certain of these polyfluorinated, and it looks like they're coming out of nowhere, because the methods, we can measure a lot of these main perfluoroalkyl substances, and we can measure some polyfluoroalkyl substances, but there's thousands. They believe there's thousands of these polyfluoroalkyl substances that we can measure in the tens, but there's thousands out there, and so it looks like it's coming out of nowhere. But there's ways to estimate the total polyfluoral substances, even the ones that we can't measure directly. So it looks like it's just this biological transformation of these chemicals kind of coming from the same industrial uses as the perfluoros. But yeah, so that's I think one of these key communication challenges is yes, it's increasing from the wastewater plant, but it's not from the wastewater plant. They're just a passive receiver um, of these chemicals. These are used by industries, gradually leaching from consumer products. This is in no way the wastewater treatment plant's fault, not their liability. And and the best thing is to get the polluters to pay, to the extent that we legally can, and then also to avoid this in the future, right? So that's something that a lot of people bring up, and that the EPA is working on. And there's you can argue both sides with everything, but um, it's such an interesting topic to me anyway, because you have this broader universe. All right, so there's these 6 PFAS that this new drinking water rule covers, but then there's the way I put it. I read this fact that if you were to take 6 Lego blocks, if you were to take 6 2x4 Lego blocks,
With you so far. All right.
Yeah, now he's speaking.
so you could put them together this way, put them together that way. There are more ways to combine 6 2x4 Lego blocks than there are atoms in the universe.
What?
Wow.
Get out of
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, because it just goes up exponentially. By the time you get to 6, it's more than like 10 to the 80th, more atoms than there are in the universe, right?
Mind
So in the
blowing.
same way,
I know I'm spending my
people,
weekend now trying to prove or
yeah.
disprove.
Yeah, don't test me, or you'll spend the rest of your life. But so it's kind of funny. Like, as you see people trying to communicate about PFAS, first is, oh, there's 1,000, then it was, oh, there's 3,000, then it's, oh,
Right.
there's 5,000. Well, we just define a PFAS as anything with at least a certain number of fluorines, or at least a certain number of fluorines arranged in a certain way. There's an infinite number of ways you can combine carbons and fluorines. So, but even taking a more limited definition, there's over 1,000 PFAS that have been registered and used in industry. And so part of what the EPA is doing is they're cracking down on PFAS under TSCA or TSCA. So they're putting these really strict requirements on anything that meets certain structural definitions of PFAS. They're requiring companies to report not just ongoing use, but even going back all the way to 2012. That you have to report any of these 1,000 or so PFAS. You have to go back in your records and figure out if you used it all the way back to 2012. And so from the perspective of these businesses, like, wow, that's a really, really hard rule to comply with.
I don't even know what I had for lunch yesterday. I don't even know that. And you want me to go back to 2012? And okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I know, right? But the intention behind that, right? The attention behind that is, polluter pays, right? And also to avoid this issue in the future, right? Because it keeps coming out. They keeps coming out like, new study, the more you look, the more you find, right? So how toxic the scientific community believes that PFOA and PFOS are. It's got the level of toxicity, it's gotten lower and lower over time as there's been more and more studies on it, more and more toxic effects, larger and larger sample sizes, and also just the random chance of how the statistics in your study come out, right? And so a lot of these other PFAS besides PFOA and PFOS, the state of the science is, oh yeah, they're not as bad as PFOA and PFOS. In many cases, they're still maybe around as toxic as arsenic, but at least they're not as bad as PFOA and PFOS. And the shorter, the smaller the molecule, generally the less toxic it is. But anything that has a large number of those fluorines is going to be at least relatively persistent in the environment. And so that's kind of like a warning flag, if you will, because right, for something to have a negative effect, it's how toxic it is once it gets to the human body. But for it to get to the human body, it has to first last in the environment.
True.
Right.
Yep.
So part of what the EPA is doing is trying to prevent a similar kind of event like this by more closely monitoring future PFAS to try to identify which of these might be similarly toxic, similarly persistent as PFOA and PFOS before they've been used in these vast quantities these vast quantities that PFOA and PFOS were used in.
Okay.
Or it's too late.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Timing is everything, and we're already behind the eight ball. So, Kyle, I want to take a moment just to thank you for all the information you just gave us and our listeners
And the passion.
Yeah, right. I mean, there's no question that you are truly a thought leader within this space, and just bring a wealth of knowledge. So, on behalf of Kevin and I, the listeners of the Water Online show, the users of Water Online, the market as a whole, I want to thank you for bringing this information to light and for taking some time to answer some of our questions and get out to the marketplace, get out to municipalities and utilities everywhere as to what this actually means. Help translate, sort of like what you did with Kevin and I a couple of times in this interview, like breaking it down to Legos. Like that was smart for us, right? We got it now, right? But
so much science,
right? Yeah. So, but to break it down for the water community, the wastewater community, and those listening and those that will access it through Water Online and on Spotify and Apple Podcast, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your expertise. I want to thank you ahead of time for helping municipalities and utilities and guide them through this process, because it will be a process and it will take time. But with market leaders like you and thought leaders like you out there for help, it's certainly much appreciated. So you could just let our listeners know, how can they reach out? How can they reach out to you for help? How you can help them? What would you like to tell them?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn. Kyle Thompson, working for Carollo. Email address ktompson@carollo.com. So that's CAROLLO.com. And and I just this is a big issue, and Carollo is really great at what we do. We got a lot of smart folks, and we try to offer the whole menu of services, right? So we're an engineering firm. The bread and butter of what we do is designing drinking water, wastewater, and reuse facilities. But we're happy to help on these issues like communication or source investigation as well.
Well, certainly, if you're going to be starting this process soon, if you're a utility or municipality out there that will be starting this soon, and you really need to start soon. The time is now. Carollo Engineers is there to help. Thank you very much, Kyle Thompson. We appreciate it, and we can't wait to have you back as we go through and try to navigate this process as we go along through 2024 into 2025 and all the way to 2029. We look forward to having you back soon. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Travis. Thanks, Kevin.
Yep. Appreciate it,
Good to be
Kyle.
on the show.
And for all of you out there listening, we will talk to you next time.